The election is over and President Donald Trump is set to return to the White House. And along with that, there's going to be a lot of changes in American foreign policy and how the United States deals with the rest of the world. And we have on with us today Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who actually worked for a period of time in the first Trump administration, had some direct engagements with the former president, now future president. And we have him back on the show today. We have him back on phone today. He's not able to join us on video, but he is definitely with us here in spirit with a big smiling face and certainly his voice. Doug, welcome back to the show.
Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you loud and clear.
Excellent. Good.
So yeah, listen. Just first of all, I just kind of want your views on the fact that Trump was elected, that he won his election, and apparently in quite convincing fashion. How did you see that unfolding?
Well, I think everyone agrees that Donald Trump's victory means that we have dodged a bullet, since most of us were convinced that Kamala Harris was never in control of anything anyway. And the plane, or instead of ship of state, I would say the plane of state, was on autopilot, headed into the side of a mountain. So that much I think we can celebrate. As for how it all happened, I don't think we know yet. And there'll be lots of retrospective assessments, but it'll take a while for us to find out exactly what did or did not happen.
But as you say, that it has happened, and so the big question is going to be is what impact is that going to have on the situation now, and especially in foreign policy. I want to look at two specific areas today to get your views on, because they both have a lot of potential ramifications for the United States, both good and bad, depending on how the administration plays them out. First of all, I want to look back. One of the things that Trump was so famous for was his so-called max pressure campaign on Iran during his first campaign, when he ended the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, kept pressure on Iran, etc. And some people say it was a great success. Others argue it was actually a disastrous failure. But it was also done in an environment where there wasn't a war raging on in the Middle East. Now that he's coming back in, some people say he's just going to reboot that to do something here. And in fact, we have there was an interview on CNN with Brian Hooks, who is potentially going to be the next Secretary of State. He's currently helping the transition for the Trump administration. Went on to talk about some of these issues, and I want to play a couple of clips for the viewers here, because what he says I think is important, and it gives some clues as to what maybe the Trump administration is going to do and maybe what they're not going to do. Here's the first one.
If the United States, working with our Gulf partners in Israel, are not able to deter Iran and its proxies, you have war and violence and bloodshed in the Middle East. And if you take a policy of appeasement and accommodation with Iran and increase the daylight between America's partners, calling countries pariahs and lecturing them on how they're supposed to live, you lose deterrence. And if nobody believes that you have a credible threat of military force, then you're going to lose deterrence. And so I think President Trump, as he demonstrated during the 4 years of his first term, weakened Iran economically and militarily, and weakened its proxies, and he deepened his alliances with Israel and Gulf partners. And if you do that, it's a winning formula.
So now, actually, before I can get you to comment on the specific views that he laid out there, I wonder what your thoughts are on Brian Hook. If he is indeed nominated to be the Secretary of State, is that good or bad for America?
Well, first of all, I don't know that he's going to be the nominee. I have not heard his name in connection with that. If he's not the nominee, he will certainly be the Undersecretary of in the Department of State for something, or the deputy, one of the two. So he'll play a very strong role. I would regard Brian Hook as a more aggressive version of Tony Blinken. So in that sense, nothing is changing at the Department of State, except the new incoming crowd is likely to be far more belligerent about the use of force, specifically against Iran.
Well, that's actually not very encouraging. But what do you make of what Brian Hook said there, specifically in relation to trying to say, well, Trump had a winning formula in his first administration, and so he's going to replay that here because there wasn't a war raging on, according to Israel, a 7-front war, and so that is the case now. Can he replay that maximum pressure campaign, and will it reap any positive benefits for America?
Well, the discussion about deterrence and appeasement, this is old, worn out neocon nonsense. The neocons permanently live in the 1930s, and everyone that doesn't like them or support them is Hitler. So I would just dismiss all that nonsense immediately. It's just meaningless garbage. I think there is a danger that President Trump will come into office with a group of people, all of whom share the view that nothing has really changed substantially since they left. And that, of course, is fundamentally wrong. The Middle East in particular, but I would argue the entire world has changed dramatically. And the catalyst for the change has obviously been the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine, which has been won by Russia and resulted in the destruction of all the Ukrainian forces that were NATO trained, equipped, and in many cases, NATO forces masquerading as Ukrainians, have all failed and be destroyed. So our position in the world, our credibility militarily right now is very much in question. And I think that is a very serious problem, but I don't think it's hopeless. But the answer is not to bully and threaten people that join BRICS, bully and threaten China with tariffs that we cannot possibly enforce and are largely meaningless now, because China, like Russia, has grown dramatically and is really no longer vulnerable to our tariffs and threats. So I think the Middle East in particular is now solidly opposed to Israel. And the word in the Middle East is very straightforward. The age of the Balfour Declaration is over. There will be no more peace with the Israelis unless, of course, they accept in principle and in fact, as a precondition for any sort of relationship in the future, a Palestinian state. And so those things are facts. Iran is infinitely stronger and more capable. Although pitted against us and Israel, it's certainly in a lot of trouble. But now Iran is tied very closely to Russia. China will back Russia in whatever Russia does. Everyone in the Middle East that may have disliked Iran in the past is now agreed that Iran deserves support. And Turkey is on the edge of intervention in this war because of what's happening in Syria and Lebanon. So I would say his general description and the notion that this old formula has any validity or capability is absurd.
One interesting thing regarding what you just said there about a Palestinian state, the CNN reporter who was interviewing Hooks tried several times to get him to ask him what is going to be the Trump administration. Instead of answering that question, he talked about how successful the IDF was.
He isolated Iran and he weakened Iran economically. And you talked about a regional balance of power shifting. Israel has had enormous success against Hamas and Hezbollah, which are two terrorist proxies of Iran, Muslim Brotherhood offshoots, and part of this sort of extremist ideology that President Trump worked with leaders in Saudi Arabia and UAE and Egypt to combat. I have no reason to think that he won't do that again.
It's interesting in there that he's like ignoring the elephant in the room, which is the kind of the core cause of all of these things that have exploded since 10/7 of last year. But then he makes this really odd claim, I think, that the IDF has had enormous success against Hezbollah and Hamas. Now, without question, they have just devastated the leadership of Hezbollah and have killed tens of thousands of people in the Gaza Strip. But even according to Israelis, several generals have said that maybe half of Hamas has been knocked out. And now we're in the 14th month of war, or pretty close to it. And that's no closer to being over with before. And there is an enormous military challenge left before the IDF IDF in Lebanon, then I don't see how they're going to accomplish both of those. So do you agree with his contention that the IDF has had enormous success, like that means anything operationally?
Well, Brian Hooks is doing exactly what Tony Blinken did, which is repeat Netanyahu talking points. So the signals unambiguously to everyone in the Middle East. In fact, I suspect throughout most of the world, but certainly in the Middle East, in the region where Israel exists, that nothing is going to change. If anything, things could get worse. And of course, this is the question on everybody's mind in Iran. You know, are things going to get worse, or are they going to stay the same? I think they can bank, based on his comments, on things getting a lot worse. Now, as far as his assertions, they're no more valid than the assertions made by Netanyahu or Blinken or anybody else. The truth is very different. And there's no point in debating it with these people because they're ideologues. They are committed Israeli, what's the right word? De facto supporters, citizens, advocates, whatever. So he's very much an Israel firster, and he's going to continue to repeat whatever Netanyahu says. So I wouldn't even debate it. I mean, it doesn't hold up to closer scrutiny, as you're pointing out, but it doesn't matter.
Well, and that's one of the bizarre things to me, because it has to matter. I mean, it will matter whether anybody wants it to or not. It's going to, because you can't get your policies accomplished the way that you want them to if you're not playing with the full deck of cards and recognizing all the factors that are at play on the table. Otherwise, you're going to be, seeking the unattainable for the incoming administration. One of the key ones, and I'm going to play one more piece for Brian Hooks, because on the one hand, he's talking about we can't appease Iran and we have to go back to maximum pressure and all this other kind of stuff, which implies the threat of military action against Iran. But then at the same time, he says this.
President Trump has no interest in regime change. The future of Iran will be decided by the Iranian people. I think we've said that repeatedly over 4 years. But what President Trump did say in Riyadh was that he would isolate Iran diplomatically and weaken them economically so that they can't fund all of the violence that's going with the Houthis in Yemen, Hamas, Hezbollah, PIJ, and these proxies that run around Iraq and Syria today, all of whom destabilize Israel and our Gulf partners.
So how can you even have a plausible path to say we're going to bring change to the Middle East, but we're not going to do regime change, but we might use military? I just don't see how those things are congruous.
Keep in mind that the alleged Gulf.
Sorry, we seem to have lost you, Doug. Can you still there? We seem to have lost Doug there for a second. I think we'll try to get a reconnection there. Well, in the meantime, we'll keep on discussing. I'm sure he's going to get a reconnection here in just a second. One of the big questions that we're going to have to answer and find out, and I think right now it's unknown, is to what extent will Donald Trump be willing to push back on Benjamin Netanyahu? And as we've seen here many times, Biden was not willing to push back on Netanyahu at all. In fact, they had a very distant relationship, if they had anything good at all. Apparently behind the scenes, they would curse each other. But in terms of action, Netanyahu was definitely the senior partner, and Biden was the bystander, because every time that Biden said that we want this, we want to do this, Israel did something different. And Netanyahu was unambiguous and unafraid, even in public, to repudiate. He had several times, he expressly said, we'll tell our friends no, and we'll tell them yes if we can, but we don't have any problem telling them no. But by the way, keep giving me all of your plane loads of missiles and bombs and everything like that. So it's unclear whether Trump is going to be willing to do anything different with that. And I know Doug has mentioned a couple of times before that just the reality of American politics is that there's lots of Israeli-backed money in the politics, and they've got to keep a lot of these folks happy, their backers. And so there's, he certainly has had a lot of pro-Israeli positions, which has been a very long-standing American policy to be pro-Israel, of course. And for a lot of that, there's actually some good reason to be so. but not exclusively, and not when other aspects that have American national security interest, i.e., the entire region and getting along with everybody, is also at stake. And when you see, so many Palestinian people being killed, and all appearances that some of the Israeli positions may be to literally depopulate the Gaza Strip, and they're on a path that seems to be doing that. They definitely destroy the capacity for the Palestinian people to have any kind of life at all. 100% of the Gaza Strip is now dependent on foreign aid. They don't have any capacity at all to self-sustain, and that's going to continue on God only knows how long, well into the future. It is not in American interest for that to continue on, because that violates many American values and principles. It certainly harms our interest in the region that we're seeing supporting that. But will Trump push back against Netanyahu if it comes to American interest there? And that's certainly one of the things I'm going to be looking at to see, we'll do that. So I think we might, Doug, do we have you back there?
Yeah, something went wrong, and I'm back. I don't know.
Okay, well, great. Oh, yeah, perfect timing there. So let me get your view. Will Trump have any better of a record at pushing back on Netanyahu than Biden did?
Well, let's step back for a minute and consider President Trump's larger strategic approach, which I think is now emerging in the team that he's putting together. He said that he wants to end the war in Ukraine. And I think he's communicated that to Putin. He's also said that if Putin refuses to end the war assuming on whatever terms are offered, then he'll double down and support Ukraine, which I think is an unhealthy and ill-considered comment at this point. But, I think this is part of the neocon approach, which is to put your right hand out to shake hands and hold the axe in your left hand ready to chop. I don't know how that'll go, but I think what his hope is that he can meet with Putin, and that in doing so, he's going to make an offer. I don't know if he'll say, well, we'll delay NATO membership for 20 years, and in the interim, Ukraine, or what's left of it, can be neutral. Is he going to quibble over territorial issues? Is he going to offer to lift sanctions? We don't know. And in the meantime, I think he's going to try and do all of those things in some form, maybe more, in the hope that he can persuade President Putin to do two things. Obviously, to abandon Iran and the Middle East to us and Israel. And then secondly, ultimately try to drive some sort of wedge between Russia and China. Now, let's take the last point. The wedge between Russia and China is an impossibility. Russia and China have a mutually beneficial relationship on every level, and neither is going to walk away from the other. So that's a dead end. There's no hope for that at all. And even to pursue it is absurd. This is like tariffs against China. China now does more business with the rest of the world than it does with us in Europe. And as a result, they could care less what we do. If we don't want to do business with them anymore, they've got 1.8 trillion on an annual basis with the rest of the world as it is, and they can make do without us, just as Russia has learned they can do without us. Now, on the second point, abandoning Iran, I think that Iran is a very important state in the larger calculus of this BRICS organization because of its oil and natural gas wealth. It's not the only thing that Iran offers, but it's substantial. It represents a nation of over 100 million people. It is enormous in size, almost the size of Western Europe. And it is wedged in between the Persian Gulf and the Indian Ocean, and of course, Turkey and the Caucasus. This is very close to Russia. This is very important to Russia. Russia wants to build this relationship. So whatever we think we can offer, I see absolutely no chance whatsoever that President Putin is going to abandon Iran or anything else and say, okay, in return for that, if you just let us alone and we're allowed to sit here and we do this deal on Ukraine, then we won't interfere with anything else. I think that's foolish nonsense and has no chance of success. But my impression is that is the strategic approach that is developing.
And so what about if he's not going to have any success with Putin? And we're going to talk about that more in detail in a few minutes. But what about Netanyahu? If Trump gets to a position where he thinks, okay, this is not in America's interest, and Netanyahu says this is in our interest, and he goes in this direction, Netanyahu has shown that he would completely ignore Biden throughout his entire, ever since this war started, that he had no hesitation to go against the American president then. Will that continue under Trump?
I suspect it will. I don't think that President Trump is going to discover the gulf that exists between Israeli interests and American interests. I think he's going to insist on seeing them as one and the same, which, of course, is Mr. Netanyahu's desire and the desire of the lobby and the enormously powerful forces that have helped to elect Trump and poured so much money into his campaign. I think that the view will be that we must press ahead in order to secure Israel's position in the region permanently. That means more than defeat Hezbollah temporarily or Gaza temporarily, because those problems are not going to go away. They're permanent. I don't think the Israelis can kill their way out of that, contrary to what they may think. But I think it means helping to establish Jewish supremacy in the entire Middle East, which with pieces of other people's countries and the expulsion or killing of Arabs inside Israel, and potentially pushing them into probably Jordan, assuming that the Jordanian government survives, which seems unlikely. So the point is, I think all of this rests on wishful thinking, but I see no evidence that he's going to abandon it. Now, maybe once he's inaugurated and he realizes the costs to us, I think the costs to us are enormous. I think our position in the region, frankly, at this point in the Middle East is finished. You can certainly ask Ambassador Freeman about that, who's much more in touch with it than I am. But my perception is that we're finished in the region. We have not a leg to stand on anymore. So I don't see it working, but that's what I see happening. And I just don't see President Trump backing off of his current position, which is their interests and our interests are the same.
Well, let's certainly hope that there's some daylight does appear in between now and January 20th of next year when he takes the reins, because I couldn't agree with you more that our situation is there is a big gulf between Israeli interests and our actual interests, and I hope he discovers that.
Well, Dan, before you leave that, let's just make sure the audience understands something, the people listening. When you go to Washington and you begin talking to these people, whether it's Brian Hook or Tony Blinken or any number of these characters, they really feel nothing but contempt for much of the world. They see us as the superpower that can march with immunity and invulnerability all over the place. They continue to view, particularly in the Middle East, these countries as weak, countries that can't put up any resistance to us, countries that can be bullied into submission and eventually compelled to bend the knee and accept Israeli dominance of the Middle East. I don't agree with that. I think they're delusional, but I think they really feel that way. So when you bring up and say, well, you know, so-and-so in Iraq says this, who cares? Their view is, who cares what these people think? They're going to have to do what we make them do anyway. I don't see it that way. I think the world has changed dramatically. This is not 1910. This is not 1945. This is not 1965. We're
going to continue to monitor all this. And as always, we're very grateful for you coming on and sharing your expertise today. Thanks, Doug.
Okay. Thanks, Dan.
And we appreciate you guys too. Be sure and like and subscribe if you haven't, and you can count on us. We're going to continue to be on top of this for you. And anything that breaks, whether it's in the Middle East or in the Russia-Ukraine war, we'll be on top of it for you. We'll bring you that news as it breaks. Thank you very much, and we'll see you on the next episode of Daniel Davis Deep Dive.